All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. And I want to welcome Amanda Preston, who's going to talk about thriving as a PDA family through the lens of foster care and adoption. And we're very thrilled to have Amanda here. We're going to let her introduce herself and share her screen. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Amanda.
Thanks. Okay, I'll share my screen in just 1 second so I can see the chat before I go to share it. I'll just start by sharing who I am. I am Amanda Preston. I am an adoptive parent to 8 kiddos, 16-year veteran foster parent. I'm a social worker. I've worked in children's services. I've worked in foster care, founded a national charity supporting adoptive and foster families. I also run a mental health clinic that specializes in PDA and supporting neurodivergent families. So we do all sorts of wraparound services, assessments, parent support, that sort of thing. And then I run a business just doing online parent coaching and courses for families who are neurodiverse. So that's just a little bit about my background. One of my kiddos is PDA, and just a heads up that his nervous system was very activated about 5 minutes before this webinar started. So if you do end up hearing any type of screaming or anything like that, you all probably can relate, and my husband is safely with him, so he is not alone. Just as a heads up. So before I share my screen, maybe if you guys just want to mention in the comments, how many people here have never heard of PDA before? I have a brief introduction on what PDA is, and I'll just skip right through it or breeze, just touch on a couple points if most people here already have a really good understanding of PDA. So if you want to just post in the chat room if you're new, and if I don't see many people that are new, then I will really only touch on a couple things there. Give you guys a moment. Once I share screen, I can't see the chat, so.
I know there's a way, but I've never been able to figure it out.
Okay, so it seems like most people are going to know what PDA is. So I will only touch on a couple pieces then. Let's see here. And in case there's anyone that watches the recording afterwards. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So let's just double check. So thriving as a PDA family through the fostering and adoption lens. So when we look at the PDA kiddo, there's already a lot of complex pieces that come along with that. But when we look at it through the adoption foster care lens, there's a lot of additional nuances that really need to be considered in order to not only support our kiddo to the best of our ability, but to also just thrive as a family. We want our whole family to do well. And there's a lot of different pieces that come into play when you're in the adoption foster care world. So these are just a few of them listed here that you guys can see.
Real quick, it says audience window for me. Is that what everybody else sees, or do they see the slideshow?
I was just texting you, Brooke.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Can you hit enter full screen mode, the purple button? Do you?
I think, Amanda, you have to do it.
Yeah, Amanda, you have to hit that purple button, I think.
See this right, like.
Or maybe she can't see a purple button. That's weird, if so.
Do you see where it says, yeah, it doesn't let us.
Oh.
Okay.
You might have to try a different presentation mode.
I've never seen this before.
Nope.
Yeah, because it's saying for us audience window, this window is what your audience sees. Drag it to the screen your audience will be looking at and enter full screen mode.
Okay, I see no other buttons. So let me see if I start again, if it gives that option.
Try present. Oh, whoops. Sorry, my kid. Hey, Frank, you got to move.
It did the first.
There we go.
That worked? Perfect. Okay.
All right.
Excellent. Okay, let me just get rid of these little video boxes so I can see my screen. Oh, that ruined it, didn't it?
No.
It didn't. Okay, my screen has now disappeared.
I don't know if you're on your first slide though. The slide that's up now, I don't think is your first one, but maybe that's intentional.
It says the adoption foster care lens, and that's what we can see right now.
Okay, I'm so sorry. My screen has turned completely blank. So let me
take your time. Don't stress.
Okay.
PDA community, we are troopers. We roll with everything. We're flexible, which is one of the beautiful things about this community.
Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah, it's the same slide. So just making sure that's the one you want to be on.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry about that. Technology is definitely my weak point. So we can see that there are a lot of different pieces that go into the puzzle when we're looking through that adoption foster care lens. So right off the bat, as most of you already know, we're going to be dealing with trauma. Whether you have kids that came to you when they were 5, 6, 7 years old and have already experienced some sort of trauma, whether that be abuse or neglect, or even kids that have come to you right at birth. We know that kids, even if you've had them straight from birth, are going to have some sort of trauma through adoption and foster care, either prenatal trauma or from the very cause of just being taken away from their birth family. So the trauma piece is going to add that extra level when we're dealing with a PDA kiddo. We're also going to have the culture component. So while this might not be applicable to everyone, many of us end up parenting kids that might be from a different culture than ourselves. And there's just a lot of different pieces that go into that, which I'm going to talk about further on in the presentation. We've got openness. So if you're a foster home, you might be having visits every week or every couple of weeks. If you're an adoptive parent, you might have some sort of openness with the biological family, whether that is visits or just letters and pictures, or even just sharing their story. That's going to be another piece to consider. We've got policies, which I'm also going to talk about in a little bit, that make a big impact in how we can approach our kiddos a lot of the time. PDA, as a lot of you probably know, is really an outside of the box approach when parenting them. Low demand parenting, as we'll discuss, is not just a common approach. It's not something that a lot of people understand, but we have this box around us, around policies and how we can approach that. There's legal rights. Some of us might not be the legal guardians of the parents of the kids that we're parenting. We might be dealing with multiple diagnoses. There might be siblings involved, whether they're biological siblings or foster siblings or any other kids that might be in the home. And we're dealing with attachment. So there are just a lot of different components when it comes to PDA, when you mix it into that adoption foster care lens. So as we go through the slides today, we just want to keep in mind all of these different pieces. And if we can kind of embrace all of them and approach them from a different lens, then that's how we're going to end up being able to thrive as a family. So I won't go into too much about this since it seems like most people know. Just in case there is anybody new, I do always like to emphasize that PDA individuals have a very highly sensitive nervous system that triggers a threat response, which we are going to focus a bit on, and that they are described as having a hard time with everyday demands, and they avoid them simply because they are demands. So, every time I click on the box, there we go. And that some people have referred to it as different names. So if you start to hear different names out there, extreme demand avoidance, pervasive drive for autonomy, those also mean pathological demand avoidance. And it's not something that is in the DSM-5. Now, this is really important as we move forward, because when we are dealing with policies, when we are dealing with other people that are the legal guardian, it's actually going to play a role that it's not in there. PDA, for those of you who are new to it, is considered a profile of autism. It is not something that can be diagnosed on its own. So we really have to get the right people and the right documentation in line often in order to get the supports and advocate for it, since we can't always make those decisions on our own. So for any of those new people, I'm going to really quickly go through these slides, but I know that there will be a copy of these slides available. So if you are brand new to PDA and you want to have a much slower ability to read all of these different presentations, then you can look at the slides. But I also would highly recommend going to the PDA North America website, where they actually have a free PDA 101 course for you to take, so you can get just a bit more information about what it looks like. But for those of you who are here because maybe your kiddo is diagnosed with ODD and you've been hearing that it can be misdiagnosed as that when it's actually PDA, or maybe someone has mentioned, oh, some of those symptoms sound like PDA. These are just a few of the different pieces. So I won't go through all of them, but it can be a sudden change in mood, a tendency to be comfortable in role play or pretend, They obsessively resist or avoid ordinary demands. It's not limited to a single activity like school or homework. Now, that's not to say that it has to happen in multiple environments, but it does happen in multiple areas. And the avoidance is pathological because it does not appear to make logical sense and it is pervasive. You're going to end up seeing it in all areas of your kiddo's life, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit. They might appear to be dominating or bossy towards peers or siblings. The behavior can seem manipulative, but it is not, as we will get into in a little bit. The traditional reward and consequence-based parenting is not going to be effective. So a lot of the things that we will have been trying that just seem like they're not helping are just not going to be effective, and that's because it's PDA. They have a sensory profile, so they can often experience over or under sensitivity in all or any of their senses, so the sight, smell, touch, vestibular, proprioception, or hearing. And some people don't realize the interoception is actually a big one. So kiddos with PDA might not be able to feel that internal body signal of I'm hungry or I'm thirsty, or even bodily movements like relating to toileting. And we're going to talk on why that's important because of some other traditional adoption-related techniques that we're often taught. So that's just a little thing to keep at the back of your mind. So this is the big one. So because all of you are in the adoption fostering world, I'm going to assume that you have already had a lot of training on the threat response. So this is when the brain or the amygdala determines if the environment is safe or a threat, and the PDA brain is very heightened. But the adoption and foster child is also going to have that very heightened brain response because they have that trauma history. So when we have a PDA kiddo, it's already very sensitive. When we have a kiddo through adoption or through foster care, it's also very sensitive. So when you end up combining the two, we have an extremely heightened nervous system that is going to be even more so with just one or the other of those two scenarios for the kiddo. So just as a reminder, in case it's been a little bit since you've looked at it, we've got the 4 different responses: the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The fight, pretty obvious. They're going to fight when something activates that nervous system. It can be verbal, physical, or defiance, and it can even be as simple as saying no. The flight is when they will run away. This can include body functions. Freeze is one that often, when we are still rooted in some of our traditional parenting techniques, which if you haven't really embraced that low demand parenting approach yet, can sometimes be our automatic response, especially with a lot of people of a certain age who were raised the same way, and often don't recognize the freeze response because, yes, they shut down, they might become mute, they might become extremely overwhelmed with anxiety and unable to respond. And so what might happen is we'll have a kiddo in our home and maybe something has activated their threat response and they are suddenly freezing, but they've done something that we have perceived as maybe disobedient or naughty or something along those lines. And in our traditional parenting model, we're going to go up to them and we're going to say, what happened? Why did you do this? You know better. Really trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. Well, the kiddo is not going to respond because they've entered into that freeze mode. But we're not recognizing that they're in that freeze mode, and we're assuming that they're just choosing not to answer on why they haven't, done something or why they did this seemingly naughty behavior. And so it can then activate our stress response, and then we can get very escalated and get angry and that sort of thing. So the freeze one, I feel, is one that can often be missed, and we can get angry quite easily with that one. So just as a reminder, that can look that way, that even if a kiddo knows the rules or knows what is right and wrong, that doesn't mean that they're not going to still have this big response with their nervous system to something that has caused them to go into this threat response. The last one is fawn, and that's when a person adapts to fit into a situation and not be targeted, and it can look a lot like masking. So the PDA response is primal. It's a threat response to keep safe. It is not generalized anxiety, but threats to autonomy can heighten the anxiety, which can cause panic. So this is really, I want to say, step 1 in thriving as a family is really changing our mindset on our PDA kiddo. And that is that they're not having a tantrum, they're not having a meltdown, they're actually having a panic response. to that threat, which is a demand. So any demand that we're doing, any threat to their autonomy is going to have them have some sort of response, which we need to remind ourselves is a panic attack. If we just assume that kids are being naughty and they're trying to fight some sort of rule or discipline or anything like that, it's easy for us to get upset. And then it creates this whole cycle where we get upset and then we're upset at our child. We then might feel bad about the way we responded. We might feel upset about the parenting techniques, and it can just spiral really fast from there. If we can change our perspective that it's actually a panic attack and that our kiddo needs help, it can really bring our own system back to a place of calm and a place to be able to help them, and also figure out how can we prevent them from having this panic attack again? Because it's not always just about how can we stop this current panic attack? It's how can we change the environment so they don't have a panic attack again? How can we make this a safe place for our kiddo so they don't always have that threat response? So the anxiety piece is really big. So what are the demands? A lot of you might already know most of these, so I'm just going to touch on them because we're then going to relate them to the demands that can be in the adoption and foster care world. So a lot of these are everyday things like eating. It might be a demand to ask them to come sit at the table. It might be a demand to eat a certain food. Dressing can be a really big demand. Transitions, a huge one. Schoolwork. We have activities, chores, self-care, super big one in the PDA world. They might struggle with brushing their teeth, having baths. A lot of parents report that their kids are only able to bathe maybe once every couple of weeks. That's really common because it's a really huge demand for them. And then of course there's the outliers like questions, choices, laws, instructions, wants and needs. I think that's really important just to remind everybody that demands are not just things that they don't want to do. You could have a kiddo that is in a soccer group and they love soccer and they want to go, but it's a demand to get out the door and go to soccer. And they know that they have to go to soccer. And so that's a demand on them, and it makes soccer really difficult to attend. So we're going to jump back to that very first slide that I did. Now we're going to look at how some of these, which are very important pieces of the adoption foster care world, and how they might be a demand in that child's life. So let's, for example, look at culture. If you are raising a kiddo outside of your culture, there are demands of how you are making sure they're staying connected to their culture. Maybe you are supposed to go to cultural events. Maybe you are supposed to have them eat food from their culture, or decorate their bedroom to align with their culture. Those are all demands for that kiddo. What about openness? With fostering, this can be particularly tricky because often we are having multiple visits a week with biological family, and we're having to get the kiddo out the door on a multiple basis throughout the week. And maybe they have to see social workers, and maybe they have to see a specialist. Maybe they have to go to all sorts of different people that are related to that openness piece and to the foster care piece. There might be policies that are involved that are a demand that maybe the child has to, sorry about my dogs there. Maybe the child has to attend certain meetings or get shots at a certain time, or just different pieces that are wrapped around the policies. We've got legal, and that can be maybe they have to testify in court about something, or who the parents are and who gets to make decisions can have an effect and place extra demands on that kid. We have siblings, and maybe they have to visit their siblings who are in another foster home, or maybe there are siblings in another adoptive home that we're trying to stay connected to, and trying to embrace that can act as another demand for the kid. And then of course there's attachment, which I'm going to go into a little bit later. But just even the very essence of trying to form an attachment can feel like a demand for our kiddos. And so with PDA, a lot of the things that we learn in some of these PDA courses is to do this low demand approach, avoid certain things, don't overload them, and just to really make things as simple as possible. But then you enter through the adoption foster care world, and we're thrown this whole pie of different pieces that just kind of blow everything out of the water in terms of trying to be low demand. So for foster parents and adoptive parents, it's kind of hard to thrive when we suddenly have two really conflicting pieces. We have all these requirements of the adoption foster care world and what we know to be true for the PDA world that are kind of smashing up in front of each other. And so that can just make a lot of chaos and stress. So I'm just going to touch on the PDA versus ODD and conduct disorder for any of you who are here for that reason, just to kind of move forward with that. I'm just going to move this down a little bit. Hopefully that doesn't ruin it. Oh, it did. Okay, so this is sort of a controversial topic. I'm going to share to the best of my ability of what I have experienced. So PDA, of course, is the pathological demand avoidance. ODD is oppositional defiance disorder, and CD is conduct disorder. Now, there's a lot of people and research that has been showing that ODD might not actually be a real diagnosis, that it doesn't really capture people. And I'm a little bit torn on where I stand with that. So in my family, I've got a kiddo with PDA, but I also have a kiddo that is diagnosed with ODD. And that kiddo does not in any way meet the requirements or present in any way to line up with the PDA autism profile. Now, do I think a lot of people get misdiagnosed for ODD when really they have PDA? 100%. I think there's a lot of clinicians out there that don't know about PDA, they don't understand PDA, and they're giving this ODD diagnosis. And it's really missing the mark because then we're missing out on how to support the kids accurately. We're not able to do that low demand approach because that's not necessarily something that's being taught to support ODD kids. And then we're also missing that autism piece, which carries so much more with it. But what I have seen in my personal life is that my PDA kiddo and my ODD kiddo are very different, and it is easy to tell which is which. So ODD is defined in the DSM-5 as a pattern of angry and irritable mood, argumentative, defiant behavior, or vindictiveness, and conduct disorder as a pattern of persistent violation of societal norms and the rights of others. So how does that kind of present differently? So simple demands and requests are usually acceptable to children with ODD, given sufficient inducement. So my kiddo with ODD, if I say, look, I will give you that last cinnamon bun if you clean the kitchen, or if you finish your homework, I'll give you $10, or let you go buy something from the gas station, I can probably convince that kiddo to do it. If I tried to do that with my PDA kiddo, as I'm sure most of you could relate to, there's no way. There's no way I can convince a PDA kiddo to do something they don't want to do. And if I try to push it, and even just by suggesting giving them something, I very well could activate that threat response. And so there's a big difference between that. The other one is that aggression usually occurs in contexts in which there's either provocation, so a threat or frustration, or instrumental gain, like theft of goods. So if I were to corner my kid, and not physically corner them, but if I were to say something like, if you don't do this right now, then you're going to have this consequence, there's going to be a very large response because I have cornered them in it. Whereas with the PDA, I mean, first of all, you would probably never do that, but the PDA isn't going to have that same response only when you corner them. They're going to have an aggression response over seemingly small things. Of course, depending on the kid, because every kid has a different threat response. But PDA kiddos, they might have a really big threat response to something as simple as just the other day, we took his bagel out of the toaster and didn't put the peanut butter on fast enough, and so it wasn't warm enough. And that actually created a really big response because of that bagel. So it wasn't something that really made sense the same way as a kiddo who's saying, you're going to lose out on something fun if you don't do this right now. Children with ODD or CD can also vary at avoiding detection, whereas PDA children do it in a relatively socially unsophisticated and obvious manner. So with my PDA kiddo, if something has activated his threat response and he's not masking, so this is kind of masking aside, you know, if we're out in a public place and something activates his threat response, he might respond with swearing and could care less that anybody is hearing or is noticing that that's happening. Whereas with ODD, they're going to be a lot more careful about anyone noticing. You might not even know that they are avoiding certain things because they're doing it secretly. I also want to point out that ODD is generally seen in just a few areas that really make sense. So they might be avoiding things like chores, they might be avoiding things like homework and consequences, whereas PDA kiddos, they struggle with all demands. We are talking about the demands that, well, I already mentioned all of them, with food, with things they enjoy, with self-care, just all the different areas we're going to see that demand avoidance. So that's just a little bit about PDA versus the ODD diagnosis. So if you think, okay, based on what you've said, I actually think PDA might be something that my kiddo's struggling with. And so maybe you need to go get an assessment. There's a few things to point out. Because you are an adoptive or foster home, likely as a foster home, you are going to have the social worker pay for that assessment. Or if you're an adoptive home, you might have post-adoption funding, and we don't want to waste our opportunity of this funding. So you really want to make sure that you are calling ahead to make sure that that person who is assessing your kiddo is going to do it to their best of ability, that can, really notice the hard to spot kids. So often PDA kiddos get assessments and they're missed the first time. Usually because families just don't know about PDA, they don't know about what to ask the assessor, and so they end up having to get a second one. Well, as a foster parent or an adoptive parent, particularly on the fostering side, we might not have that second chance. We might not be able to ask for a second assessment. And if the people who are doing the assessment don't understand that kiddos with PDA have more eye contact, they have more verbal fluency, that they do role play and pretend, and that they're affectionate, charming, and sociable, they're going to say, no, this kid doesn't have autism, and you're not going to get the diagnosis. And then you're going to run into a lot of difficult situations because if you have a social worker that is the guardian of that kiddo, and you still believe that, like many of us have gone through, that your kiddo is autistic, they do have the PDA profile, so you are doing this low demand parenting approach, you might have a social worker that's saying, no, why are you doing that? You did an assessment and that kiddo doesn't have autism, so why are you doing that approach? You can't do that. Or why are you asking for these accommodations at school? This child is not diagnosed with these things. Now, I myself went through this with my child, where we did do our first assessment through the foster care system, and he didn't get the diagnosis, but then the adoption happened and we were able to do a second one. But I was able to still go with my gut that he had PDA because we were adopting him. And so we could still kind of do some of those approaches that we knew were right. But if you're a foster parent and maybe there's no adoption in sight, reunification is what's the plan, then how are you going to approach that if you don't have anything on paper that is kind of giving you the green light? Because in the PDA world, a lot of people do self-diagnosis, not just as adults, but for kids. So maybe they have the autism diagnosis, but not the PDA one, and they are just doing that because they know that that's what their kiddo is dealing with. We don't have that same luxury in the adoption fostering world. So the documentation actually matters, particularly on the fostering side, but even on the adoption side, because you might be accessing post-adoption supports. You might be connecting with biological family or other people that are still involved. Maybe you still have post-placement visits for the adoption. There's a lot of different reasons why there's a lot of eyes that might still be on you. And so we just don't have that same freedom to do whatever it is that we want to do. Kiddos through adoption and foster care can have a lot of concurrent diagnoses. So ADHD is really common with PDA, but once we start entering the adoption and foster care world, we start hitting up a couple other ones like FASD and NAS. NAS is not really used anymore. That's neonatal abstinence syndrome, but really we're just talking about prenatal drug and alcohol exposure. We've got the ODD and the conduct disorder, which is not something you would have in addition to PDA. It's that people are diagnosing you with that instead of PDA, but just to be aware that those are the diagnoses your kiddo might have come to you with. Of course, there's the autism, which is, goes hand in hand with the PDA. Your kiddo might have intellectual disability. They might have reactive attachment disorder, which I would argue is just as complex as the PDA piece. So it can make it a lot trickier to try and navigate some of those pieces on how to support them best. And then we might also have some learning disabilities. Now, why do I talk about some of these concurrent diagnoses? Because a lot of them have overlapping symptoms. And why does that matter? Because we have a lot of people when we're in adoptive and foster home that are looking over us. And if we want to be functioning well and thriving as a family, we want to have not too much stress in our home. We want to not be always judged and second guessed on everything that's happening. But if you start looking at some of these symptoms, you can see that a lot of them are very familiar if you have a PDA kiddo. So some of the ones might be under or overreacting to pain, difficulty in sleeping and eating, trouble playing with peers, no sense of personal boundaries. They might be overly friendly with strangers. We might have self-injury. They might have an atypical response to sensory stimuli. There may be behavioral challenges, emotional insecurity. They might have severe mood swings, and they might be destructive to self, others, or material things. Now, if these are symptoms of PDA, and many of them you see with PDA kids all the time, but they're also symptoms of trauma, and suddenly you're being monitored by a lot of people in your life, what can happen is we can see some of these professionals will step in and say, wait a minute, this kiddo looks like they might be experiencing trauma. So what's going on at home? You're telling me that your kiddo is screaming, that they can't go to school, that they're harming themselves or others, that they're damaging things in your home. So what's happening? And so we can actually end up going down a really dangerous route that could lead to allegations or investigations, even in the adoption world, because adoptive parents are sometimes held to different standards depending on what state or province you might live in, because they can look so similar. On the same thread, they might not be willing to accommodate some of the supports you want to do because they look so similar to other diagnoses. So FASD, for example, which is really common in the adoption and foster care world, is going to have a lot of these symptoms as well. So if you go up to your social worker and say, well, I would really like to get some funding for an autism assessment, or I really like some advocacy at school to have accommodations for them for their PDA. And they say, well, this all lines up with FASD. Why would I do that? You're going to really run into some big walls that you can't really surpass because it lines up with FASD. So why would they go and support you in pursuing some PDA diagnosis or an autism diagnosis? So the combination of how closely they can relate to each other can really make it difficult for us to move forward as an adoptive and foster parent. And that trauma piece as well is just like, we really have to be careful because a lot of people are going to make judgment around that when actually something, and it could be trauma. We have kids with trauma all the time, but we need to somehow flush out what piece of this is trauma and what piece of this might be PDA so we can adequately support them. So what is the family experience like with all of this? So parents of children with a PDA profile, they often report that they feel they're walking on eggshells. They're constantly fearful of an outburst or meltdown. Now, this is actually quite common with other diagnoses as well. I've seen parents who are parenting kids with FASD, especially reactive attachment disorder as well, where they feel like they're on those eggshells. The family home is where the child often feels safest to release their pent-up anxiety. So in situations like this, we can also be made to feel very inadequate and become isolated. So what we see is a lot of kids will mask, and I'm going to talk about just that demand piece when it goes overflowing in a moment. But what can happen is the kiddo might show some of these symptoms of PDA in your home, but they're not showing them maybe on a visit with biological family, maybe when they're at school, maybe when a social worker is visiting. They might present as just the calmest, coolest cucumber ever. And so then we have people who aren't believing us what we're saying, or starting to question, what are you even talking about? Why are you saying this is going on when clearly we've never seen any of this? So not only is it hard to advocate for supports, but we can start to get people questioning us. And it's tricky when we aren't the legal guardians, or when we have different roadblocks as adoptive parents to access supports, when people want to see documentation and they want to see proof of different things. And PDA doesn't always come with such easy proof. For other children, the demands of school can lead to severe meltdowns within the school environment, and this can lead to multiple school exclusions from an early age, as well as school refusal. Now, as an adoptive family, that isn't as tricky, but when you're still in the fostering world, that's extremely difficult. A lot of us PDA parents take for granted, not for granted because a lot of us work and can't just easily homeschool, but as a parent who has the legal rights of your kid, we can make that decision if it so suits our family and works to pull our kid from the school and offer homeschool, which many of you might know is a really common thing for parenting kids with PDA. School is such a place of high demand and kids reach burnout very quickly. And so a lot of families have to turn to homeschooling. And not only homeschooling, but they turn to unschooling because the kiddo's not going to be able to handle demands of traditional homeschooling either. They're often having to look at it completely different. But what are the odds of getting a social worker to sign off on doing something like that? What are the odds of biological families signing off on something like that? So there's a lot of different pieces that come into play that as a family, we're trying to support the child to the best of our interest, but there might be these walls that are preventing us from doing so. And I will just mention that some children, as they grow older, may become more self-aware and develop improved social understanding and become more skilled at self-regulating their emotions. And this can reduce some of the more challenging behavior. But just a reminder that PDA is lifelong. And, you know, we're going to try and change the environment to the best of our ability for our kiddo, but they might have other diagnoses as well, like FASD, which is lifelong. Reactive attachment disorder. We've got all these different diagnoses that are going to stay with our kids for a long time. So we have to somehow figure out how we can create an environment for them long term that's going to be safe and that's going to be welcoming to their nervous system, despite whether they're able to, you know, start becoming a little bit skilled at different aspects of that. Masking is really important, as I just mentioned, because of the different people that are involved when you're an adoptive and foster parent. So most of you will already know masking will involve hiding their discomfort, avoid feeling embarrassed, a desire to be accepted, don't want to appear different. They suppress their behaviors that are soothing. So a lot of that stimming they're not going to do. And it's a survival mechanism. I love this graphic by NeuroWild. If you don't follow her, I highly recommend it. But it just shows what our kiddos might be going through. You know, you've got that cute little round donut and then the long johns. And what does that donut have to do to try and look like the long johns? Well, they're chopping pieces off, filling in that hole. And I have to say that donut does not look very happy, even when they try to make themselves look like the long john. And so what ends up happening is kiddos are spending their time in different places, trying to mask, trying to hide who they really are, and then coming home to us where they're really letting out their true selves. And we're going to see some of those big pieces. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can keep track of that and how we can document that so that we do have a little bit more to go off of when we're interacting with social workers and we're interacting with other people that might have more say in how we support the kiddos. But this is something that if you are here tonight and you're a professional and you work in some sort of professional capacity as well, that we really want the professionals to understand so that they don't think we're just some crazy parents that are saying, you know, oh, this is happening and it's really hard. And them saying, well, we don't see it anywhere else. So what are you talking about? In fact, just today, I had someone tell me that they told their school about some of the challenging behaviors that were going on at home. And the school's response was, well, that sounds like a you problem, not a me problem. And that just like, I don't know, that hit me really hard that a school would respond that way because, yeah, maybe they're not exhibiting some of these symptoms at school, but we want our kids to do well all the time, even if they're not, you know, as a kid, I want them to be good at my home, but I want them to be good at school. And I would hope that as a teacher, you would want the best for that kiddo as well. So really understanding that the kids are masking is really important, and trying to ensure that other people around us understand that as well, because again, we're not always the final say in the adoption fostering world. This next one is really important as well. So leveling, there's a few different terms. So some people refer to it as leveling, some people refer to it as equalizing, and recently some people have started saying instead coming into balance. So you're going to probably see all three of these terms And what it is when the PDA kiddo is perceiving a loss of equality or autonomy to another person. So the threat response will activate and they will reflexively try to equalize or level to the other person to try and get back to a place of nervous system safety. And birth order can play a role in this, because if you have a kiddo that came from their biological family where they're the oldest child, and now all of a sudden they're in an adoptive or foster family where they're the youngest child, that's going to have a deep, deep response to their perceived loss of autonomy. They are used to being at the top of that hierarchy, and all of a sudden they're at the bottom. And at the end of the day, kiddos with PDA, they don't really even live by hierarchies. And all of a sudden, the people who believe like the older siblings who are going to be acting like, well, I'm the older sibling, you have to listen to me. And that kiddo's used to just the natural being at the oldest of another family, of how that hierarchy works. And it's going to have just a lot of fallback, because we might not see it. If you don't know, maybe you don't know the makeup of where this kiddo has come from. And with adoption, we usually do, but with fostering, so many times we have no information, no history, no backstory. And the kiddo is acting out, and we don't know why. Why, if we know that they have PDA and can at least understand that it's their threat response, but we're not understanding why, what happened, what was the trigger. And it could be because of this shift in the birth order now that they're in your home. The PDA brain perceives a loss of autonomy to those around them in stature, authority, power, position, or control, causing their brains to perceive danger and activate that flight, freeze response that we talked about. We don't want to view them, though, as showing manipulation, controlling behavior, impulsivity, or OCD behavior or defiance. That's not what's going on, but it can really look like that. So this might look like leveling in your home might be PDA kiddo is on the couch, they are watching a show or playing on their iPad, they're engaged, and two other siblings are at a table playing a board game. They're laughing and having fun. PDA kiddo suddenly recognizes that these two siblings are laughing and having fun, and they're going to feel that loss of power. These two kids are having fun and I'm not involved. So PDA kiddo might get up, walk over to the board game and swap it off the table. So for us, we might think, what just happened? Like, why did kiddo just do that? That seems like it was out of nowhere. No one was doing anything to him. No one was harming him or insulting him. Why did he just go do this? So we have to remember in these situations, it's not them trying to be defiant or manipulating. It's just their threat response. They felt the threat that they didn't have that same position or control compared to the two kids. And this can get really tricky when you're an adoptive or foster home. So what that means is adoptive and foster families are commonly known to grow their families with multiple children or take new placements often. We really need to think about that, as with any diagnosis that you have in your home, about continuing to grow your family with where your kiddo is at and what the needs are. So if you have a PDA kiddo and maybe you have some other biological children and you're thinking, I would really like to adopt again, or you're a foster home and you are thinking, I have room for one or two more kids on top of this, you want to consider some of these other pieces before moving forward. Now, I've got 8 kids. I am a huge advocate for big families. I'm in no way saying that you can't still add more kids to the family, but you have to take a really close look at the dynamics of your family and who you would be bringing in, because number one, we want to consider safety. Sometimes kiddos with PDA, when they get their nervous system and threat response activated, are going to turn to fight. And that might result in some safety issues. I know so many PDA families where they actually have moved in such a way that a mom will live in one home and a dad will live in another home in order to keep those siblings separate, just because of the volatility that might be going on. You also have to remember that other kids coming into your home, if you are adopting them or if they are foster kids, are going to have trauma and PTSD. So if they have seen domestic violence, if they have been abused themselves, it might not be the best environment for them to come to a home where there might be a lot of volatility going on. This is in no way to say that it's purposeful or that a PDA kiddo is doing something bad or wrong. That's definitely not what I'm saying here, but that we do want to consider that, especially some of the pieces that I just talked about with leveling. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have more kids. Maybe, and this is of course dependent on every single child, maybe your PDA kiddo is younger and maybe they only do leveling with kids that are younger than them or around the same age, but don't do that with older kids. My PDA kiddo, for the most part, only does leveling with kids his age or younger, but doesn't seem to do it with his older siblings. So maybe I would look at, if I was bringing more kids into the home, only bringing in older kids. So those are just a couple of the things you want to consider. Also active status. So if you are a foster parent and you want to keep your home open, but there's a lot of dynamics that end up going on in how your PDA kiddo might interact with other kiddos in the home, that could affect you remaining open depending on what goes on in the home. The logistics are another thing to consider, especially if you're a foster home where you are having to go to visits multiple times a week, and maybe your PDA kiddo isn't old enough to leave home alone, so you're having to get them in the car and out of the house multiple times a week to take other kids to visits, to go meet with social workers, different pieces like that, maybe to go to counseling or specialists. Well, your PDA kiddo might not be able to manage that. I know that my PDA kiddo, I cannot get out of the house for the life of me unless he has given consent to do that. And so if I had to go to multiple visits a week, I would not be able to do that. So taking that into account. And again, maybe you can still move forward, but maybe you only accept placements where you know that a driver is coming to get the kiddo for the visit. Where I live, they actually do that, which is amazing. Where I used to live, they didn't do that and you drove to the visits yourself. So maybe that would take that issue away. And then, of course, there's allegations. Kiddos that are autistic, they have different sensory needs. So sometimes just like brushing by them, they can feel that as this really aggressive or physical pain or hurt. And all of a sudden you're a foster parent and kiddo says, well, my foster mom hit me this morning. Well, you didn't hit them, you just brushed by them. But because you are in this fishbowl, in essence, as a foster parent, then you have all these different eyes looking at you. And as I mentioned before, it comes into that complex piece of them, they might not be diagnosed with autism, or they might not have that PDA profile on paper anywhere. So who's going to believe you when you're trying to talk about, well, this kiddo has some sensory needs, this kiddo has some other things going on, and then that can just lead you down another path that is really stressful. So, this is just, it's not about capacity. My husband and I used to always say that we would probably have 12 kids. I don't know what we were thinking, but we used to always say that. And we were going to foster until we were old. We were going to start taking teens. But we got to a point where it wasn't about the number of kids, but it was about meeting their needs. And I can no longer effectively meet the needs of any other kids while also meeting the needs of my PDA kiddo, because I can't be driving around town. We homeschool now, and so I can't be, going to different appointments and bringing him to different appointments. I can't be going to all the different cultural pieces as easily anymore. And so for me, I know that I can't still be a foster parent, and it's not on our capacity, and it's not just based on a number, but it's based on meeting the needs. So these are some of the things that as a family, to do well, we really want to consider, because we don't want to, I do think as foster and adoptive parents, sometimes we get into it and we want to help all the kids. We want to, well, I've got these skills, I've got the ability. There's still so many more kids in the foster care system that need support, or there's so many kids that are waiting for adoption, and we want to keep adding more to our family. But it's very well going to add to your own burnout. And if the parents are burnt out, then you're not going to be able to parent effectively either. So this is just kind of a reminder, not to say that you can't still grow, but just to really take a close look at each kiddo in your home and the different dynamics. And this is not PDA exclusive. We see this with even FASD. Sometimes we've got, or RAD, the reactive attachment disorder, that maybe it's a little bit trickier to add kids to the family because of some of those dynamics. So just really considering that. So how are we supporting our kids? So of course we want to do low demand parenting. Most of you, since I didn't see anyone in the chat that said they were new to PDA, most of you will likely already know what low demand parenting is. It's kind of like what it sounds like. You're trying to reduce the demands. But with adoption and foster care, we're having to kind of look at this a little bit differently. We need to focus on the PDA first. At the end of the day, the nervous system really controls a lot of pieces, and we want our child, we want them to feel safe. We don't want them to be in a constant state of, one moment. We don't want them to be in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. So we're going to get to some of these other pieces, and we're going to say, wait a minute, how do I do this then? So for example, culture. My 4 youngest kids are Métis. And we, we're trained all on how to support their culture, how to embrace it, the different things to do. And so I remember one time we had gone to a cultural event. This was when my PDA kiddo was a lot younger, and it was still a little bit easier to get him out of the house. And the elders were doing a prayer, and they required everyone to be quiet, and they would not start the prayer for the elders until every single person in that room was quiet. Well, my PDO kiddo didn't want to listen to that demand because he was told that it was a demand. And so he started talking and he wouldn't stop. And there was nothing I could do to make him stop talking. And he not only didn't, wasn't able to stop talking, but he sensed that everyone else was quiet. So he no longer wanted to attend meetings like that where there was this demand put on him. But then after that, it was also hard to just get him out the door to these events. So following up on the culture piece can be really tricky. Now, by that same piece, you might have that struggle with openness, trying to get them to visit. So how do we do that? What are we doing? What if we're just trying to talk to our kid about their birth family? So if you're an adoptive family and maybe you don't have visits, but you just have pictures and letters that you do throughout the year, and we're just trying to share with our kiddo their story, who their birth parents are, different pieces like that. While many of you who are raising PDA kiddos might know, conversation isn't something that a PDA kid always wants to do. If I try and have a conversation and it's not on a topic that my kid wants to talk about, there's no way I can continue talking about it. So what do? This is where strewing comes in. Now, strewing is not foolproof. It does not work for all kids, but it is one way that we can try and get them somehow connected to some of these pieces, so that we can still function as a family, so that we're not stressed out, because we can't thrive if we are stressed out. And so if we're like, oh my goodness, like I'm trying to support my PDA kiddo, but they won't go to the cultural events, they won't eat the food that I'm giving, because a lot of autistic kiddos only eat their safe foods, and maybe a cultural food isn't safe to them at that point in time. So we're stressing out about how we're not meeting our requirements as a foster adoptive home, because even as adoptive parents, we might have signed a cultural plan of what we have to do, even after we're the legal parents. So strewing is where we're going to just leave things out. So it's not a demand. We're not telling them to do it. And we're not like trying to shove it in their face. But what I might do, for example, for a culture one, is I might intermingle some cultural books of maybe the Métis culture in with a couple other books that I know he likes, and leave them on the coffee table. Maybe I am going to, for openness, leave a little photo album on the dining room table or next to his bed of his birth family. Maybe I am going to make some sort of cultural food with a couple of the other kiddos and hope that my PDA kid notices and wants to just join by seeing us doing it. So this is where you would just be laying it out so that they still have access to it, but you aren't forcing it on them and they can choose to do it. For any of you that are struggling with this piece, some other options are things like YouTube videos. You can access a lot of cultural things on YouTube videos, like drumming videos and dancing and different cultural traditions that they might do. And PDA kids love YouTube. So if you can get them involved in that, maybe you search it up. This is being kind of sneaky, but you maybe search it up so it's like in their YouTube history. So then they just happen to notice it there and think, oh, I'm going to go maybe look at it. Now, when I say this isn't foolproof, I'm just going to lay it out there. Some kids pick up on this and know what you're trying to do, and they're going to figure it out quite fast. So this might not be, a foolproof solution, but I would definitely recommend trying it just to see, so that you can somehow have some of those pieces from the adoption foster care lens intermingled into that approach with PDA kids. So this really requires you to change your perspective and expectations. Everything we have learned as an adoptive and foster parent is focused. I would say culture and openness are two of the biggest ones, as well as a trauma-informed approach, which I'm going to get to next. We need to change our perspective and expectations, not only on our kiddo, but on our own interactions, our own parenting approach, and what that looks like. Now, this can be hard, especially when we have a lot of professionals in our lives that have things to say over us, but it can really make things go a lot easier for yourself and give you just, less stress if you are able to change that perspective. Understand that it's not a lack of discipline. So your attempts at doing all these different things, it's not because you're not disciplining them. You're going to hear a lot of judgment from social workers, family, friends, and that's not what's going on. And also just a reminder that we want to change the environment and not the child. So when we are supporting our kiddo, that's really important. What about navigating the system? Because PDA and the system, they don't go well together at all. So first, we want to request counseling. I think that's a huge one. If you're able to really do well, you want to make sure that you are healthy mentally. What happens often with really any neurodivergent parents, but PDA especially, is we end up flipping the needs upside down. So it's like an inverted triangle. And behaviors becomes the biggest thing. We are just trying to manage behaviors. Then comes the child's needs, and then comes the parent's needs. Well, everyone has heard a million times with self-care about, oh, you have to put on your own oxygen mask before you do another. But it's really true. We need to flip it back over into a triangle and have the parents' needs at the bottom, then the children's needs. Because if we are not in a healthy place, we cannot help our kids. And we're going to talk about something shortly with blocked care, and you can head really fast into blocked care if you're not taking care of yourself. So as a foster parent and adoptive parent, you likely have access to counseling funding. You really need to find a PDA professional. So the PDA North America has an excellent website. If you haven't been to it yet, please go to it. And they have a whole list of PDA professionals all over North America, just to get on your side. Because you might not have that diagnosis, you need to have people who understand it, that can help you, that can be an advocate, and that can go to bat with you when you're dealing with social workers or adoption workers or the school or anyone else. You want to seek support groups. That's just kind of a given. PDA can feel very isolating, and talking to someone who's the parent of just a kid with some other diagnosis but not PDA is not going to necessarily understand everything that you're going through. Document everything. Now, what does this look like? You don't want to always be living on edge yourself. You can't function well. You can't thrive as a family if you are in constant fear of what if. And let me tell you, I've been there. So if your kiddo has knocked a hole in the wall, write it down, write the date, write what caused him to get activated, and what was the fallout. What did you do to support him, or what happened afterwards? If your kid has refused going to school, document it. What did you do to try to get him to school? What happened? And why did he stay home? Just whatever you can think of to document, so that if they can then come to you with, well, what happened here? Why do you have all these holes? Why wasn't kiddo at school today? You've got something to fall back on. And that's really important. They say in foster care that it's not a matter of if, but when that you will be reported and have an investigation on you. Well, it's not just foster care. It's honestly the whole neurodivergent world, because kiddos that are neurodivergent, they react and respond differently in the world, and people who don't understand that are going to question it. So documentation is going to just be a way to allow you to breathe a little bit and not live in that constant fear, not have that PTSD response every time something happens. Connect with advocacy groups and associations. So that might be your local foster parent association, your local adoptive association, and they're gonna, while they might not be focused on PDA, they're gonna know how to advocate when things do go wrong. Homeschool is a really hard one. I already talked about that, so I won't go too much into it, but just know you can homeschool in a lot of places, even if you're a foster parent, but it takes a lot of advocacy. So getting those PDA professionals involved, getting those advocacy groups involved can help navigate that. So if that's something that you really think would suit your kiddo well, then try and, seek that support. I will caution you though, however, that if you're a foster parent and this kiddo is due for reunification, then it might not be as helpful to push for homeschool if that biological parent then can't continue on with homeschool. Then what I might advise is advocating more for changing the supports at school so that we're better supporting the kiddo at school, so that when that kiddo transitions home, they still have the same supports in place. Except that you are a trailblazer. PDA is newer. There's so many professionals out there that don't know anything about it. There's about a bazillion social workers out there that don't know anything about it. And so you are constantly going to be the one that has to educate everybody. And you're going to be advocating, and it can be hard. It can be very exhausting and daunting, and sometimes just feel like, what am I doing? And so just remember that you are a trailblazer, and that other people behind you are going to benefit from a lot of the work that you have done. The next one is practice self-care, and I'm going to go into that one further. Now, self-care, I feel like everyone always says how important self-care is, but it is so important. And they say something like, well, just take a hot bath, or go do something for yourself. Well, a lot of us PDA parents know that it's very hard to do some of these things. Some of our PDA kiddos are very attached to us or connected and don't ever leave our side. So a hot bath might not be a possibility. Maybe we can't leave the house. A lot of things can be really tricky. So what are some things that we can do? So I wrote mostly self-care things that can be done from our home, mostly, so that you can actually access it. So the first one would be having a favorite drink or treat. Now, I don't want you to go down a dark path with a favorite drink or treat. I've definitely been down the dark path in that regard. So be cautious how you approach that one. But, maybe you have just a special cup of tea after lunch. Maybe you have a favorite chocolate bar at 10 o'clock once all the kids are in bed. But little things throughout the day can actually all build up together to create that self-care piece. I'm going to do the online support last on this page because it's a little bit more lengthy. Respite, if you can access it. And don't think just traditional respite of someone coming into your home for the weekend so that you can leave, because that's really hard. I know that I can't find a single solitary person that could watch all 8 of my kids so that I could leave the house. Hence why my husband and I have probably been on a date like 2 times in 20 years of being married. But what we can do is find people who maybe could take the kiddos out. And it's not always just the PDA kiddo. Because of that leveling and equalizing piece, sometimes just having a break of the siblings together can really make things easier. So maybe you're going to have a respite worker take out the siblings to go somewhere in the community, maybe to a movie, maybe to a fun play place or an art place. If your PDA kiddo is willing and wants to go do something and transitions aren't as hard and they can go somewhere, that's great too. But just having some ability to have them go somewhere to give that little break between the siblings. A parent swap out is where you kind of acknowledge that, okay, dating is not possible, so I'm not going to go out on a date with my spouse, but I'm going to go out anyways and enjoy something that I like while my spouse stays home with the kiddo. So one parent will go out. Maybe I go by myself. Maybe I go with like a teenager, like my own teenager. Maybe I go with a best friend. And then the next time my spouse goes out. If you're a single parent, then maybe you have a best friend or a mother or a sibling that's able to do that parent swap out for you, so that you're able to just go out. But it's kind of changing that expectation. And I think it's a hard one. When we look around, especially even on social media, and you see all these married couples that are, oh, we just did this fabulous date. Oh, we just went to Mexico for a week, and they're doing all these amazing things. And we're sitting here like, I could never do that. It's very easy to fall into that pit of despair. And so support groups can really help in that, where you can see that there's other parents that are just like you. The more PDA parents that I've met, the better I felt, because I now see that everyone is in the same boat and no one is going out. No one is going and having these amazing experiences with their spouse. Maybe one day that will happen when we're 50, I don't know. But it's not happening now. And when I see that it's with other families, it just kind of brings me back to that place of, yeah, this is the world that we're in. And it puts me in a better space mentally for my mental health. And so the more you can relate to others, and the better you're going to thrive. This one, I know it sounds so cliche, but fresh air and sunshine. A lot of people will say for self-care, go and exercise, go for a walk for half an hour. Well, as a PDA parent, a lot of us can't do that. We can't just get out of the house. Maybe we are homeschooling and kiddo is home 24/7. So just getting out onto your porch for 2 minutes to absorb sunshine and get that fresh air is actually going to make a difference on your nervous system and your body. And if you can do it multiple times a day, the better. But just that little piece, I know it sounds silly. It sounds like that's not going to make a big difference, but it really truly can. And the more you're able to do it, just going out there, you'll be like, oh yeah, this does feel really good. Take in some deep breaths and just absorb that sunlight. A phone chat with a good friend, ordering takeout if you can, one meal that you don't have to worry about, or using a house cleaner a day that the house is getting clean. You don't have to worry, maybe for a couple weeks, depending on how many kids you have and how long things last. Mine lasts, I probably 4 minutes in my house, but you know, that you don't have to worry about cleaning for a little bit. This can all be a lot of self-care. The last one is an online support community. It's called Mothers Together. I am a member of it. It is amazing. What I love about Mothers Together is that you can really do it at your own time. The organizer of that is a PDA parent herself, so she really gets it. And it's all done through the Marco Polo app, which is like a video app where you kind of record yourself. Now, a lot of times people will recommend for self-care journaling, which I didn't even include here. But journaling is a mode of self-care to just let out your thoughts. What's great about this app is you are put into a group of usually about 8 women, and you're able to just let it out. But the bonus is that they're able to respond to you. So maybe you're talking, and you don't even have to talk about kids if you don't want to. You can talk about, oh, this was hard, or, oh, can I get some advice? But you could talk about, oh, I started a new job, or, oh, I'm really looking forward to this new hobby I just got into. And you're just sharing with all other parents of neurodivergent kids. So it isn't exclusive to PDA, but it's all parents who have neurodivergent kids. And you can do it whenever you want. So for me, I will sometimes do it at 1 o'clock in the morning because that is the only downtime I have during the day. As PDA parents, we know it can be hard to get out of the house. I might not be able to go to the local, autism mom group meetup. And honestly, even if I could, some days I'm just too exhausted to even do it. So being able to just like pull up my phone, go on this app is amazing. If it's 1 in the morning and maybe you're in your jammies, you can turn it to voice mode too. So it just shows your photo and not your actual face in your jammies or however you might look. And then they also have topic threads, which are amazing. So they have topic threads on PDA for kids 10 and under, PDA for kids 10 and older. They have an adoption and foster care thread. They have a homeschool thread. They have threads based on hobbies. They have threads based on what your job might be. They have threads based on something you might be navigating, like homeschooling or IEP meetings. There's so many different things. So I just want to give a shout out. It does cost money. It's pretty reasonable after 6 months. I think it's like $20 a month after 6 months. I don't remember what it was the first 6 months. And it's just a way to connect with others and not feel so isolated. And the more that you can feel connection with other people, the better you're going to do, the more you're going to survive and thrive. Especially since they do have that adoption foster care thread, and you do know all those people are parenting kiddos that are neurodivergent, you're going to have people that really get it that you can share it with. And they have intakes constantly with all new groups that you can connect with. I'm not going to go into the strategies today because most of you will already know that, and I can see that we're running out of time and I want to do questions, and I just want to touch on a couple other things, but you can look back on this and then you can go to the PDA website, PDA North America, and get more information on all of these topics. I will just say kids do well if they can. That's such an important one to note. What about TBRI? I really want to touch on this really quickly. As adoptive and foster parents, a lot of us are trained on this attachment parenting, which is amazing. I am a huge advocate for TBRI. It is an attachment-based, trauma-informed intervention that is designed to meet the complex needs of vulnerable kids. It uses empowering principles to address physical needs, connecting principles for attachment needs, and correcting principles to disarm fear-based behaviors. While the intervention is based on years of attachment, sensory processing, and neuroscience research, the heartbeat of TBRI is connection. So really quickly, some of the great pieces about it. It is focused on connection. It's giving empowerment, which is amazing for kids with PDA. It brings trauma into the whole circle, which as adoptive and foster parents is important. It speaks to trust. It seeks to give kids a voice, and it really focuses on that fight, flight, freeze response. But the caution, TBRI also really focuses on using eye contact to try and build that connection, which we know can be really hard for our kids. It involves touch. And a lot of our kids, if you reach out your hand to put your hand on their shoulder, are going to be very activated. They try to regulate demands, so hunger, thirst, hot or cold. Our kiddos are already struggling with those demands so much. If we try and give them a granola bar and they don't want that granola bar, you are going to activate that system, that nervous system, and push them into a fight, flight, freeze response. The felt safety, their response is already triggered, so we might not be able to get them to a place of felt safety. Exercise. Our kiddo might be in a place of burnout. They might want nothing to do with exercise. Nutrients, they might have just their safe foods. And for a lot of our kids, safe foods are foods that might not have the same nutrients that we're trying to give them. Hello, chicken nuggets. And the last one, I'm just gonna scooch that by, correction. Obviously correction is not something that we are going to be trying to do for the most part with our PDA kiddos. I mean, you know, maybe you can a little bit, but with the low demand approach, we have to be really careful about it. So this is just another piece that in the adoption and fostering world, we want to be careful about what approaches we are taking with our PDA kids, because sometimes the pieces that are good for adoption foster care might not be good for PDA. And that's, like I said before, why we always want to be looking at the PDA piece first, because we have to keep them in that safe place for their nervous system. Blocked care and blocked trust is really important. Blocked care is a self-protective mechanism in the nervous system activated by excessive stress. This suppresses the higher brain functions needed for caregiving, causing your nervous system to develop a defensive stance towards your child. You're still providing good care for your child, but your heart seems to have left the relationship. This is really common in adoption and foster care, and it's really common even with PDA, where parents just reach this point of not being able to connect the same way. And then unfortunately, what happens is the child's needs are not met the same way. Their nervous system begins to change, and this state of chronic distress causes the child to protect themselves, which ends up in this cycle where both the parent and child are both responding to the way the other one is responding. And you end up with this blocked care, blocked trust piece. Now, this is a whole other workshop of itself. So I highly recommend, if you are feeling anything, which I'm about to explain, relating to blocked care, to go to reclaimcompassion.com, where they have webinars and books to read to learn more about this, because this is like, I'm only just touching the surface of it. They also have coaches there who can do group coaching and individual coaching, because just as important as PDA professionals are, if you have reached the place of blocked care, oh, I forgot the O in blocked care. If you've reached the place of blocked care, you need to be having a blocked care professional supporting you in this, and you need to do that in tandem with a PDA professional. So signs that you might be experiencing blocked care is if you're too caught up in coping with your child's behavior to be curious about the meaning behind it, which is super important. You feel defensive and guard yourself from rejection. You feel burnt out, chronically overwhelmed and fatigued. You feel resentment towards one or more of your children or your situation as a whole. You feel irritable with other families and friends. You isolate yourself. You become cynical about helpful ideas. You feel you've lost compassion, which leads to shame. You experience a crisis of faith or challenge of personal belief system, and you don't feel real pleasure in parenting. So if you're experiencing any of those things, please go check out that website. So this is just a summary of what we've talked about. So to thrive in adoption and foster care, we want to continue learning about PDA. The more we know about it, the more we can change our mindset. We want to perform self-care. We want to get into PDA specific counseling and blocked care if applicable. We want to make sure we're doing low demand parenting. We really want to make sure we have that support network. It can include Facebook groups. We want to see through a different lens. So remember everything that we've been taught about adoption and foster care and what's important, we have to meld together with what is important with PDA, and then just change our expectations. So those are things that are going to make us do so much better as a family. Resources and support moving forward. Christy Forbes course, Intune's Pathway, love it. She even has an option to pay for it weekly. The PDA Society website has a lot of research on their website and information. Facebook pages and Instagram, ask in a PDA group what they recommend, like NeuroWild that I posted earlier, great to follow. It can help when it just pops up in your screen on a day-to-day basis of little things that remind you, oh yeah, because it's helpful to remind yourself that this is what's going on and this is what's behind what's going on. PDA North America, so amazing. Make sure you check out their provider list. Make sure you check out all of their resources. They have a lot of free courses there, so go check out their website. A book list, which I'll share in a second. Neurodivergent Insights is a really great website. Amanda Diekman has a course. Amanda Preston Co. is my website if you want to check it out. This is some books. I won't read them all out because you will get a copy of this, so you can go and look at this afterwards because I know I am taking so much time. And then you can also check out my website where I have a few online courses myself. I have one that just came out if you want to give it to your grandparents and extended family as an introduction to PDA. And I also do parent coaching wherever you might live. So let's open this up to questions because I know I took so long.
That's okay. Well, it looks like usually we get some questions as someone's presenting, and you were very thorough. So I didn't even see, like, there was a question about a website, and
Okay.
that's all I've seen so far. I was even thinking, because we want to end on time, maybe we'd offer, like, is it okay if people would send an email?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we can kind of go that route if we don't have time. But is there anybody who wants to ask a question? We have a few minutes. I think you were super
Yeah,
thorough.
I mean, it was great, Amanda. It was a lot of good information, and lots of things to think about in terms of foster care and adoptive kids, on top of the all the PDA stuff to think about. So I know for the people in the audience who are foster parents or have adopted PDA kids, I'm sure it was another layer of being seen and heard, which is really nice too.
I was going to add a thing. Well, I was going to add, I made a little note too. I wanted to say about some behaviors that I've noticed that people don't think of quite yet. Or sometimes we talk about it with PDA, but like silly joking or lying, and even the term manipulation. Like, I know we're trying to divorce this idea of, manipulation and PDA kids, but I'm finding it with my own advocacy stuff to like see manipulation as just another tool that a kid might use to get their needs met. So
yeah, I like the word strategic.
Yeah, strategic's good too.
Because and you have to be really, really strategic to try to get your needs met and avoid threat too.
I just want to thank you for everyone who made this happen. Having fostered and I adopted a child who has PDA. I have a lot of friends who've adopted from foster care who are very knowledgeable, work in the field, and I will go to them for advice. And so often they understand so much of what we're going through. And then there's just this missing piece because my kid has PDA, and all the things I've learned and that they've learned that work just don't work quite the same way with my kid. So I'm just so grateful to just be in this community of people who get it from both angles. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. And you've hit it nail on the head. It's true. You hit that PDA piece and it suddenly glazed over. Nothing's going to work. They don't understand.
Right. And being trauma informed is not enough. And kind of a message I've been trying to spread to the trauma informed community, because they think they're experts on neurodivergence, but they're not.
And there's this thing here. There's a couple questions I suggested. Someone asked about is PDA on the spectrum or autistic. I suggested the PDA 101 talk for that. And I don't know if we have an article.
Yes, I mean,
yeah.
So
yeah, and I've come around to understanding more, because I know why some people have a hard time with just categorically saying it is, and I think it is understanding autism better. That kind of helps understand where PDA fits into that. And then there was another question here. It says, do you find that most PDAers have a parent that is also PDA? I mean, I don't know, Amanda, I don't want to hijack you. I find it a lot in the groups I'm in. I don't know if that comes up a lot in the adoption or foster care situation, but I suspect it must. So
It does, yeah. I would say it's so common to see that in generations, but unfortunately it wasn't known. And so, for example, my PDA kiddo, his dad ended up in and out of the prison system. He ended up with a lot of domestic violence issues. And it's because he grew up in foster care and likely PDA wasn't known there. And this would have been viewed as defiant behavior. They wouldn't have done that low demand approach that many years ago. And so we see that the cycle probably started a lot of the time because they didn't have parents that knew about it and were able to support their needs and really give them that environment to thrive in. Yeah, I've seen it with both biological parents and even just in the regular PDA world outside of adoption and foster care for sure.
all right, should we end ourselves? We're on time. It's tempting to do so.
Recording too.
Oh, whoops. Yeah, well, she can edit the end part because we try to keep questions out of the recording usually, but I don't think anybody has asked anything very